Hello, hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Despite having over 300 episodes in its run, Supernatural has plenty of characters, concepts, and plot lines that many fans felt could have used more screen time. If you ask 1,000 fans to pick one thing that they felt was underused or even wasted, there's one name that'll come up more than anything else: Eve, the mother of monsters. When she was first introduced in Season 6, Eve seemed like she was going to be a big deal, and to an extent she kinda was. When I say she's the mother of monsters, that's not a poetic title. She's literally created many of the races of creatures that hunters hunt. Now, she isn't responsible for everything that preys on people. There are plenty of things that aren't related to her, like demons, angels, witches, and a bunch of other miscellaneous creeps. However, her offspring include the likes of vampires, shapeshifters, djinn, ghouls, dragons, werewolves. Basically 60 to 80% of the things that Sam and Dean had to deal with, they come from her. Now, having such a large impact on the world, you'd expect Eve to play a pretty big role in the series, right? Like she'd probably stick around for a couple seasons, and we'd gradually learn more about her story and the overall history of the Supernatural universe. Well, instead of doing that, the show decided to have her in 3 episodes before being killed off. She does get mentioned a few more times, and we even get a few tidbits of info about her, but most of them raise more questions than they answer. Now, personally, I don't think a show needs to answer every single little question. A bit of mystery is good and fun. However, since I've positioned myself as a professional obsessed freak, it is my job, no, my duty, no, my destiny to try and fill in some of the holes left in the lore. So, why not sit back and let your buddy Jack speculate about the who, what, and why of Eve? Let's start with what we do know about her. We may not have the complete story regarding what she is or where she came from, but we do have some clues. For starters, we know that she's older than angels like Castiel, which would put her around the same age as the Leviathans. That's not the only link she has to the Levis, and it's kind of implied that they may be related in some way, but more on that in a bit. In fact, there'll be a lot more on that in a bit. We know that Eve spent time on Earth around 10,000 years ago, though how exactly she got there isn't clear. During her time amongst humanity, she created the Alphas, which are the first monsters of a particular species, like the first vampire, who all current vamps can trace their lineage back to. After creating a bunch of monsters, Eve was somehow banished to Purgatory, where she remained until 2011. After Crowley started torturing monsters to find a way into Purgatory, Eve somehow coordinated her escape with a group of dragons. After her jailbreak, she took over the body of a virgin girl and began influencing her monster children, as well as creating new ones in order to accomplish one of 2 possible goals. Her main plan was to work with the Winchesters in order to hunt down and kill Crowley, her reasoning being that she actually liked the usual balance of humans and monsters. If that didn't work, then she would just unleash her new super monster, the Jefferson Starships, to infect all of humanity, meaning that everyone on Earth would end up in Purgatory, since that's where all monsters go when they die. Dean manages to trick Eve into killing herself by ingesting some phoenix ashes, which is one of her only weaknesses. She dies, but her soul eventually returns to Purgatory. In 2019, Dean and Cass take a little day trip there, and when Eve finds out, she sends Leviathans after them, with a special focus on Cass because he, quote, stole her Leviathans. That's a weird statement because the Leviathans weren't created by Eve. Ultimately, the guys get away and we don't actually see her, and that's really about it. So as you can see, we aren't starting with 0 information, but the stuff we do have on Monster Mommy doesn't exactly paint a clear picture, so how do we make sense of it? What most people gravitate towards is her connection to the Leviathans. Oh, just in case there's people watching this video who haven't watched the show for some reason, the Leviathans were some of the first animals created by God. They eventually became too smart, hungry, and dangerous to be left amongst the rest of creation, so God created another dimension called Purgatory and locked all of the Leviathans inside of it. They also have a kind of fuzzy history with unanswered questions, which I made an entire video about. You should give it a watch. Anyway, like Leviathans, Eve can shapeshift at will, deactivate angel powers, and when she's hurt and dying, she oozes a blackish fluid that looks a lot like Levi blood. Later in Season 7, we actually get verbal confirmation that there is some kind of connection between the two. While talking to the Leviathan Edgar, the alpha vampire, who, by the way, is one of Eve's first children, claims that he and his ilk descend from the Leviathans, to which Edgar replies, barely. Ed goes on to describe Eve as a filthy mutt, a whore, and hardly a Leviathan. Now, when you use words like barely and hardly, there is some room for interpretation, but at the same time, you don't use those phrases if there's no connection whatsoever. So yeah, it's likely that Eve is at least Levi adjacent. However, despite all of the similarities, she also has a number of features that we don't see in chompers. Firstly, we never see any other Leviathans create monsters the way Eve does. They do accidentally turn some people into feral zombies, however, that's a result of chemistry gone awry. By comparison, Eve can not only transform humans with a mere touch, she can also produce eggs that hatch completely new creatures. Also, she has a completely different weakness compared to her relatives. Eve's kryptonite is phoenix ashes, whereas God himself wrote that the only thing that can kill a Leviathan on Earth is the bone of a righteous mortal bathed in the 3 bloods of the fallen. We don't know whether or not Eve could be killed with the bloody bone, but the wording of the Leviathan tablet makes it seem like the phoenix ashes wouldn't burn them like it did Eve. Finally, she just doesn't really act like a Leviathan. One of the Chomper's main characteristics is their insane hunger. It's actually what got them sent to purgatory in the first place, and we never really see that kind of behavior from Evie. So with all that in mind, I feel pretty confident saying that Eve isn't a Leviathan, or at least not a full-blooded one. So then what, is she some kind of mutant or hybrid? In my personal and sexy opinion, Eve is a unique creature created by God for a very specific reason. So the big man decides that the Levis are too dangerous, and he doesn't want them on Earth anymore. He could have just wiped them out, but he didn't. He chose to give them their own dimension that's safely partitioned away from everything else. Now this is effectively a prison, but unlike the one he put Lucifer in, it wasn't a cold metal box, it was a big slice of Canadian wilderness to frolic in. This tells me that despite their flaws, God still cared about his creations and wanted them to have a decent life. The thing is, just giving them their own space isn't going to be enough. These things are vicious, and they aren't above eating each other, even when they have an entire planet to snack on. Also, purgatory isn't inescapable, and the Leviathans are some of the smartest and most cunning beasts to ever exist. Any way you slice it, just locking them in an empty forest isn't going to lead to anything good. What they need is something to keep them fed and entertained while also making sure they don't step out of line, a kind of caretaker/warden. What they need is a mom. So God decides to make them one. Instead of starting from scratch, I believe he chose to reuse the Leviathan formula with a few changes. There are a few benefits to this. Firstly, the Leviathans are more likely to actually listen to one of their own, and secondly, if they don't, then you've got something that can think and fight on their level. At the same time, you can't just make another Leviathan, because obviously that's not going to accomplish anything. So, Chuck took Leviathan DNA and mixed it up with something new. Now, exactly what he mixed it with is up for debate. However, there is one other creature that we know Eve is related to in a somewhat unclear way. In Season 6, we met a character called Eleanor Viziak, and eventually it's revealed that she was actually a monster from Purgatory who'd been summoned to Earth by famous author and infamous racist H.P. Lovecraft. We don't actually get much information about her in the show. However, Sarah Gamble revealed in the official companion to Season 6 that Viziak was, quote, a similar kind of creature to Eve, and that she originated in Purgatory. That's cool and all, but it doesn't really seem to line up, since Viziak doesn't appear to have any similarities with Eve other than the fact that they both have to possess people. What I personally make of this is that Ellie is part of a race native to Purgatory that God created to act as prey for the Leviathans. Like I said before, you can't just lock them up, you have to give them something to eat. So God decided to make Eve by mixing the best parts of the Levi DNA with that of the native species, in order to create something that had a connection to, and hopefully authority over, both sides of the predator-prey dynamic. And yet, that's basically what I believe Eve is. A glorified babysitter invented in order to take care of and watch over the Leviathans after they got booted from Earth. When the Chompers in Season 15 says her Leviathans, it's not because they're her children, it's because they're her charges, her responsibility. Now I know what you're saying. Jack, I believe and am attracted to you with my whole heart, but even if everything you've said is true, how does it lead to a world full of monsters? Good question. See, even though God stocked Purgatory full of prey to hunt, there was still a very real possibility that the Leviathans' endless hunger could lead them to wiping out their food supply. Even if that wasn't possible, they could get bored eating the same thing for eternity. Either situation could cause them to try breaking out, and you can't have that. So when God decided to give them a nanny, he made sure that she came equipped with the ability to not only keep Purgatory stocked with fresh meat, but also provide different kinds of meat that can provide different challenges so that the predators never get bored. And that solved every problem without creating any new ones. Until, of course, Eve came to Earth. Now, I have to be honest, exactly how that happened is anyone's guess. There's a whole bunch of possibilities, especially in the ancient past when there was stuff like old magic and Nephilim running around. However it happened, I think it was a one-way trip, and Eve found herself in a strange world filled with interesting and capable creatures that, for some reason, were afraid to indulge in their base desires. Think of it like this. What are some of the things that a good chunk of human societies frown on in one way or another? Murder, deceit, violence? Those are virtues in purgatory. You have to do that kind of stuff just to survive. So what's Eve to do but help these poor apes out by giving them some special gifts? We don't know if the alphas were birthed or converted from normal humans. Either are possible. However, I personally think it's more interesting if they were turned. I like to think that Eve sought out people who were already considered monstrous because they indulge in their darker desires. Civilized society saw these folks as less than human, but to someone who grew up in purgatory among the Leviathans, well, she saw them as better since they weren't inhibited by stupid made-up morals. So she gives them special powers to complement their unique natures and to truly differentiate them from humanity. The best part, at least in her opinion, is the fact that they no longer needed to worry about the afterlife. They could use their extended lives to do whatever they want because no matter what they did, good or bad, their deaths would just bring them home to mama. Now, I don't think that all of the OG monsters were originally human. There are a few that I believe Eve brewed and birthed herself from scratch. The first are dragons. Now, the dragons we see in the show may look human, but that's just a disguise. Their true form is described as bat-like, and we have semi-canon illustrations of them looking like actual dragons. Also, they're really dangerous and powerful, which again, doesn't really come across in their one appearance. What's interesting is that it kind of seems like they have the ability to communicate with Eve while she's in purgatory, and ultimately it was dragons that brought her back to Earth. All of this leads me to believe that the dragons were created by Eve to act as her personal emissaries on Earth, kind of like God with his archangels. The other monster that I believe Eve homebrewed was the Phoenix. Now this is kind of weird because, like I said earlier, Phoenix ashes are Eve's only known weakness, so why would she do that? Well, I found my answer in the official companion to Season 6, where it's revealed that the Phoenix did come from Eve, but it was unintentionally toxic to her, like cancer. I think what happened was that she tried to make an extra spicy batch of dragons, put a little too much stank on it, and ended up with something that was too hot for her body to handle. So she spits it out a little early and destroys at least one of them, but accidentally gets a face full of poisonous ashes, and just like that, her vacation is over and she's back in good old purgatory. Now obviously her children wanted to bring her back, however Eve didn't necessarily want that. Earth was fun and all, but Eve is smart enough to know that her presence there creates a risk of imbalance, the kind that got the Leviathans locked up in the first place. With her off the board, then her kids can feed and multiply at a much more manageable rate, one that gives humans a chance to fight back, and all of that results in a nice, sustainable cycle. If things ever were to get really out of hand and she were needed, then there were ways to get a hold of her, and I think a situation like that actually played out in the 13th century. In Bobby Singer's Guide to Hunting, Dr. Viziak tells the story of how the dragon swords were forged. Basically, the dragons had been relegated to the most inaccessible parts of the planet by Eve, and after a while, they decided to break the rules and started going out where the people were. One dragon, named Hippoles, who I'm going to call Hippo, didn't really like that, and he went to tattle the mommy. The book says that he went to purgatory, but I think it's more likely that he got there via astral projection or dreamwalking or something else a little less physical. Anyway, he tells Eve what's going on, and she realizes that the dragons represent a very real danger, not only to humanity, but also to the other monsters. So, Hippo allows her to kill him in order to create several dragon-killing swords. In my version of events, Eve doesn't personally do the killing and forging herself, she just gives Hippo the instructions on how to do it, and he either did it himself, or he enlisted the help of someone else. I also think that Hippo was the one who wrote that weird book that the Season 6 dragons had, you know, the one with the spell to summon Eve. I like to believe that she told him how to perform that spell, just in case the swords weren't enough, and Mother needed to personally come to Earth to spank her naughty children. The fuck is this script? Why do I write stuff like this? Anyway, none of that's technically canon, but come on, it makes sense, right? So let's summarize what we've learned, or rather speculated. Eve is a creature that God cooked up in order to watch over the Leviathans in purgatory. She's a kind of hybrid between the Levis and a special race of creatures God made to act as prey to snack on, and her monster-making powers are meant to ensure that there's always something new and interesting for her charges to hunt, so that they won't feel the need to escape their prison. She somehow ended up on Earth 10,000 years ago, and finds humanity to be a bit pathetic, since they don't share Purgatory's ideals of survival of the fittest. She finds a handful of people she deems as based, and turns them into monsters in order to spice things up. And that is how we got the Alphas and their various lines of monsters. Again, none of this can be proven, but I personally think it sounds like a decent explanation. If you also think that that makes sense, then I expect your subscription on my desk by the end of the day. You won't regret it. I've got plenty of spicy topics in the works at the moment. As always, there's no schedule for this channel, but there'll usually be at least one video a month, maybe more sometimes. There'll be more to come soon, but for now, carry on.